travels there, but also the decided we're staying. Decided we're okay. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity, fellowship, worship assembly, go through a portion of your learn and grow and understand of your people and help the presentation. God, we have several prayer requests. Replacement up on the 8th. We have several medical sickness and illness, struggling. Ask your hand for all of these. Ask your hand. Excuse me. Page 4. Version. Work in a way that only time together, help them part and return. Prayer requests that aren't listed, struggling. Child, though. We ask all these things. So, we leave off. We leave off with the giving of the 10. God speaks to Moses at Mount Sinai, and it's such this like in smoke and the trumpets and the thunder and lightning, terrifying. Imagine they getting anywhere near that would. And it's a little interesting here because I think a lot of people kind of about the law and think about what was given to the Israelites by God, and they kind of stop at the 10 Commandments, stop reading and get forward ahead, and they're like, okay, this is stuff I'm going to find to golden calf happens, or find another, and the application of the 10 Commandments, understanding more than just the God's law, first covenant, are important. While the laws don't necessarily apply to us, but we can't say it has zero meaning. Character and nature, like the laws reveal the mind of the law. Understand what God was doing, how he was creating a separate. We can understand better who God is, giving a shaping and establishing them. He was going to be the ruler, and he was turning the nation. Laws, I think sometimes we get stuck that some of them are arbitrary. Allowed to wear cotton polyester, weren't allowed to eat shrimp, but it created an ordered society. A lot of these laws, as they're still, they value priorities really constitute kind of the foundation of it. So after getting the 10 Commandments, which are kind of the backbone of the law, Moses heads back up the mountain to express the law back to the people. It's this detailed set of like civil, moral, and ceremony going to govern the life of these generations. 613 specific laws. Laws illustrate nations of the 10. So if the backbone is the commandments, then all all these subsequent laws are like souls, ligaments, all hold the law up. And the Israelites, they also are getting kind of case law as well, or any future cases, civil, anything like that that's brought before the people, disagreements and troubles. Now you have God's expectation. A lot of stuff. Just alone in chapter 21, I mean, laws for judges, law on slavery, bond slaves, marriage and slavery, manslaughter, capital offenses, personal injury law, the law of restitution, and even personal injury on the job. Borrow something. And then in 22 and 23, murder, manslaughter, violent assault, liability for animals, theft, restitution, dowry, idolatry, sorcery, disadvantaged people in society, the list and on and on. In a textual study, look at little sections of scripture. That section is out. But I think it's also important to kind of look at this broad brush. Big and small. Looking at the forest, and then you're looking at a plain. And look at this history. Think about this process. God promised Abraham, bless the whole world. Gives them the law to help them. Genesis 12 says that God is going to use the nation of Israel to orchestrate his plan of salvation for them. 19 tells them generations' participation depends on their obedience to the law. But so many of these laws are arbitrary is not the word I want to use. But they're so specific that one might look at it and go, really? Like, that's almost unnecessary. What does that matter? Why would it be that way? Well, first, the law distinguished Israel, right? Like, the law made Israel stand out in the crowd. See that one guy at the party, everybody's dressed normal, and then he's wearing a fedora. That guy's different. He's also in a three-piece suit. He's dressed different than everyone. It's this special nation, right? It's not just some nation ruled by a king. They're not a warrior tribe. They're ruled by God himself. It's theocracy, governed by God and him. So, not in an awkward way, not in an intentional way, but in a holy way, God's people. Law, the giving of the law also restrains spiritual, physical evil. It was designed and served that purpose for the Israelites, not to worship God the way a lot of their neighbors and other forms. Physical violence, sexual acts, inhuman practices, and cult worship. But the law was designed for the Israelites to worship God in a different way. So in the giving of this, it also protects classes of people. It protects slaves, women, unborn, and it's protecting. But it also restrains evil with confidence, or with consequences, rather. Exodus 21:23-5 says, "But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound." So I always thought the Gandhi quote, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world." I always thought that was a stupid quote. And the reason that I think it's a stupid quote is because the law was put in place to train that type of thing, not to egg it on. The way he prefaces it sounds like I'm looking for that eye. I'll poke my eye out so I can get yours. That's not what the law is. It is a huge mistake to read it that it was some kind of a like, go for it, like we want it to happen so that I can burn you because you. It's saying if it happens, there's going to be consequences. It's not encouraging people to not do it. Like instead of punishing crime with an unfair punishment that could provoke retaliation, the punishment matches the crime. So the law is saying don't do these things. But if you do, it's going to happen to you. And it's important to understand that, right? Like, because it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, male or female. And the law also, the other thing God does in giving them, puts on the people. it shows the hearts of them. Jumping ahead a little bit, Exodus 24, Moses is going to give the commands. People say, we'll do everything. We'll do that. Got you covered. And obviously, the chapters later, they worship the golden calf. The law told them not to do it. They did. And it reveals a deeper problem. Circumcised. But I jumped way ahead, right? Let's go back to chapter 20. So we get into the rights of slaves, 21, 1 through 11. And, it goes without saying, I feel like the general understanding what they're talking about here, not what Europe and the Americas dealt with, and transatlantic slave trade are totally separate, not the same, nothing to do. New Testament times and slavery under the Mosaic law here, night and day from slave traders kidnapping people in Africa, transporting them to South America, and English colonies, right? In no way does this apply, nor is it in any way usable to say that the historic slave trade of and justified because of Old Testament. Couldn't be further from the truth. Obviously different, and that's stain on European American history as well as Africa. In actuality, when you're in this section, you're reading about kindness, respect that's shown to these slaves and servants. It's often prefaced by God rather, beginning here, that they too Egyptian. Like, if you're going to have these servants, if you're going to have people working for you and under you, remember how you got treated. Make sure, when I'm giving this law and you understand that we're not talking about I want you to be like the Egyptians. We're talking about something different. So, kind of the golden rule. Slavery was obviously common in the world then. I think it's interesting to read it that if God would have just ignored it, then there could have been no rules of treatment, and they could have treated them harshly, treated them poorly. Since they have rights, have protection, shows that God cares well. Additionally, there are actually laws more geared towards bankruptcy. Sounds strange, right? Because we're always going to view it through the lens or the German Laban, your situation where I'm going to view it through American slavery. My brain translates hundreds of times I hear when head works. But we're talking about the implication of the government not stepping in, have a debt you can't pay, but you're not going to pay high interest till the end of time. You're not going to go to jail if you can't pay it. But a person who has found themselves owing debt or unable to pay off that debt can voluntarily sell the one thing that they have left, which is their ability to loan. Look, in 6 years, the loan is paid off. That first bond servants who did this they had their debt covered, they had a home to stay in, had on-job training. Up with debt. We see some things here that show this passion for a bondservant in this section. Dave loved his master and wanted to serve in that house and the master would pierce the slave's ear at the doorpost. The master's life. God's servant, so take me to the doorpost of Jesus, servant forever. If an Israelite man bought a female slave with the intention of marrying her and she allow her not to be bought a slave girl for his son, he would treat her as a daughter. It's important reading this and understanding that separation of looking through rose-colored glasses, or however you want to say that, looking through your understanding. Also, this is saying slavery is No wonder the Southerners did what they did. No wonder these slaveholders thought they were. No, those are not the same. One can go through this section very easily and understand that they weren't being authorized to kidnap people, weren't being told to sell them, purchase kidnap people. In fact, in Exodus 21:6, explicitly stated you weren't allowed to slave trading, weren't allowed to mistreat a person. Slavery in scriptures is not, so much so that a number of translations disregard the word slave because of the connection. Servant. When we put servant, right, like, then now I'm thinking of like Jeeves the Butler or Downton Abbey. Never watched it. A bunch of servants, right? Like people that pay and they live there and they live in servant quarters. That's not really right either. When we're reading this, we have to think about like you're paying off your debt. Way to do it. And this picture, grace of God. And even God succinctly weaves the story of his understanding of speaks to slavery, remind them how to remember where you were. Don't mistreat them, don't oppress them. Remember, you were forced into labor against slaves, and kind of speaks to our story here. Them differently. And obviously, by the grace of God, we're set free, debt free, freedom, everywhere. One, for freedom in Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again. Slave, or in what So we'll get into laws pertaining to violence and abuse in 21:12 through 32. Obviously, these verses contain God's law for how the Israelites are to deal with violent crimes. Accidental harm done to another person, violence done to animals. God lays out these judicial consequences for people who were murdered, who were accidentally killed, who strike and curse their parents, masters who hit their slaves, men who get injured in a fight. We're going to skip that one. Men who strike pregnant women, animals owners whose animals are harmed by other people. And it's interesting when you read these, when you hear an eye for an eye, and if you kill, you're going to get killed. There's many society-wise that argue this sounds like it lowers the value of life. And it raises the value of life because it raises the punishment for taking life. Life is valuable. Life is important. Life matters. It's so valuable because we're made in the image. So the only punishment enough for taking life is. We also should note that God makes a difference in differentiating the type of violence, and the type of murder, the type of death. Someone who murders someone else by accident, moment, fight, that person doesn't need to be executed, right? Most modern laws make these similar. Carter and Clayton, and the difference between, say, manslaughter and premeditated. A person that decides for a week and a half that they're going to kill their wife, and the other guy that gets in a bar fight and hits the guy and he falls and hits his head on the brick wall and dies. Like, why does God make the distinction? Answer, concerned with the action, he's also concerned with the people's hearts and their motivations. And that's what these distinctions show more than anything, is planning out a murder shows hate, shows vitriol and anger, right? The law doesn't excuse manslaughter. If you read the section, manslaughter, the penalty was exile. You still had to go out and live out in the twigs somewhere. You had to go to the city of refuge. It's still a hefty punishment, but it's a reminder that God understands and God cared about the heart of his people as well. And he made these distinctions to discourage bad behavior, to discourage hatred, and to discourage anger and revenge. We even move into laws regarding restitution for animals, right? If somebody digs a pit and an animal falls in the pit and the animal dies, the man who digs the pit has to pay for the animal. It's interesting to read these needs for restitution, but God is trying to create a people here, and he's trying to create a people that he wants to be like him. If you read something, right, about an animal being killed, if an animal was to be sold and that animal got killed, then there's restitution and then they split the money. But what that is it's creating an understanding of God's heart in this people. He's trying to create laws that show how he is a forgiving God and a merciful God, and he's a vengeful God, and he's a jealous God, and he wants his people to be like him. So when we read these laws, it's easy to read at straight value and go, if the ox was accustomed to goring other oxen, the man who owned the violent ox was required to pay full price for the ox his ox killed. Everybody got that? And you're like, oh, okay. That was number 458 of 613. But there's more to it than that in this study. We see the need for redemption, or restitution rather. It continues the paying back and the avoidance of poor behavior that leads to you needing to pay back, right? It goes from chapter 21 all the way through halfway through 22. Restitution is this key component to God's law, and it didn't matter who you were. That's such a huge part of this law. And it was such a distinction from a lot of Near Eastern law codes, right? Like, if you've ever heard of Hammurabi's Code. Anyone heard of that? Hands? It was an ancient Babylonian, Mesopotamian legal text, and it had 282 laws. But those punishments mattered based on who you were. You had a caste system, you had a class system. There was a difference between property owners, slaves, and free men. And you think about that, where justice comes in direct correlation with your social class. and how you were able to get recompense and restitution based on who you are. That's pretty gnarly when you think about it. That's pretty rough. Like, oh, he killed your wife? Oh, but you're a nobody. So, sorry. But with God, all were equal before him in the law. We're seeing description of loving one's neighbor as himself. Committing an offense required restitution. And not only restitution, but even more is repaid depending on the infraction. You actually can see an account of this with Zacchaeus in Luke 19. Zacchaeus says, "And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." Jesus' response is that salvation has come into his house. And that's this heart of repentance, right? And looking at this restitution, it was, don't do those things because that's not things that we do. That's not things God's people do. But if you do them, you're going to pay for it. And you're going to pay for it with some interest. You're going to pay for it with some vig, whatever the gambling term is. When we do wrong, we try and fix what we have done. And it feels like a typical response from somebody might be like, oh, well, I broke your toy. Oh, well, I knocked your fence down. My bad. But that's not right. And that's not just. And that's not what God is describing here. And paying for what we've done and when others suffer loss. God is showing justice and fairness in these chapters. He's showing his justice and fairness, and then he is telling people, hey, listen, if you're with me, this is what we look like. This is how we act. This is how we carry ourselves, and it comes with strict consequences. So the second half of Exodus 22 through the first half of 23, it continues this theme of justice in a social setting. I'd say social justice, but that's obviously been perverted, and justice doesn't need a modifier. Justice is justice. So you're reading about these people and their need for justice and all individuals under God's law. Sorcery was punishable by death. Lying with an animal was punishable by death. Sacrificing to other gods was punishable by death. They were commanded not to mistreat widows and orphans. You're not to lend money with interest to your own people. You are not to provide false reports. Another important reminder of us, right? You shall not revile God or curse a ruler of your people. Do not speak against God. Do not speak against rulers over us. Even doing good to your enemies. Do not pay evil for evil. The list goes on and on and on, right? And then lots of these are taught in the New Testament as well. They are mirrored. This is what God's people look like. And even in Mosaic law, like you were to help your enemy when possible. When you study these passages in the law of Moses, you're able to see the religious leaders weren't really representing what God's original intent was for the law during the time of Jesus, right? You're reading Jesus saying, you have heard it said, hate your enemy, but I tell you to love your enemy. You read this Sermon on the Mount and you're hearing interpretations that have been I don't know if I want to say that word, that have been changed and perverted and illegitimized from what God's presentation was to the people. Religious leaders started to take these ideas and kind of add their own swing to them and their own tint and their own flavor. I've read stories and studied stuff where they would even find loopholes later on in Israelite history and Jewish history. They would find loopholes of like, well, if I put it on my windowsill, then it's not work because it was already there. I did that on Friday, so on Saturday, I'm not breaking any laws here. I'm finding loopholes. Any thoughts? I feel like I'm just lecturing. Thomas, yes.
So I'm preaching on the law today, so I've been thinking about this all week, and really, I think the best way to think about law is not as statutory law, but as case law, like you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So for our statutory laws, we have just, if you've ever done any sort of research into what the WACs, right, the codes for Washington or King County or
Well, absolutely. I think it's multiple aspects of that, for facets, or however you want to say that. For sure, your first approach, and this is always a subject for debate, your first approach is that the New Testament is new law, and those are new things we follow in order to go to heaven. It's not Jesus that died on the cross for us, but it's that I don't let unwholesome talk come out of my mouth. Good luck. Best of luck with that. I don't know if I made that today so far. Another idea is that looking for loopholes, you read that everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial, right? There's an understanding, and it's the same thing here, right? The development of covenant, the development of the relationship, either with God and the Israelites, or any kind of understanding of New Testament Christianity, is about relationship. These are things that you do and don't do as God's people. You're a saved people. You've been bought and purchased by Jesus. You've been freed from Egypt as Israelites. This is a list of what I'd like to see you act like, and this is a list of how one acts. And sure, people do both sides. People do very liturgical. It has to exactly be done this way. Wait, you did 2 songs and then a prayer? It's 3 songs and then a prayer. I go to heaven I go to church every Sunday. When those doors are open, I'm there. I'm a better Christian. There's a number of things that are similar in that way. And I think that the understanding of, like David Ingram said, an understanding of like the initial regulations are creating this relationship. You're building a society and you're developing what God wanted from these people to be a people that, took their laws and their rules from him. They didn't have a king, judges. They didn't have city servants. They had God. God wanted them to look to him to be governor and leader and ruler. And so I think each of these laws sits on that foundation of loving God and his people. And we start to develop this through these first 3 chapters. We start to develop community, this concept of community. And the covenant relationship with God involves corporate relationship with all these other people in covenant relationship with God. You have duties to God, but you also have duties to each other. And I think we have that today too, right? Like, I'm in my own personal relationship with Jesus, but I'm also in a community relationship. Not only do I need to act a certain way, but I need to treat others the same way. Yeah.
Again, this is a Hebrew-centric activity. And this is God showing community with the Hebrews. You speak about community, and this is not one man dealing with another man. This is a product of a loving God producing in whole flesh and whole cloth a law that was demonstratable and repeatable among the Hebrew people, and then it could be elevated to the rest of the world. And one of the things the rest of the world saw was a people delivered from Egypt, a people that were actually given a law, and then a people that were led directly by God. And this, again, is within a 4-week or a 3 or 4 month period of time. The rest of the world marveled. And the law was not something that one man used against another man. When that started, people said, "You're just like us." But in this particular case, when someone from outside the Hebrew nation looked at the Hebrew nation, they saw balance in love. They saw God going beyond any law that they had. They saw a perfect gift from God to the Hebrew children, something the Hebrew children and the Hebrew judges could rely upon to be balanced and fair.
Absolutely. So we'll close with chapter 24 here, and we're presented with burnt offerings and purification of the people, and we basically get God's amazing covenant with his people and seeing what God does with the people of his covenant. And it's interesting because there's some huge comparable Jesus-Moses here in chapter 24. And we see our relationship to God through Jesus in here. In 24:1-2, God tells Moses that Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel are going to go up to the mountain, and they're all going to worship from afar, and Moses alone is going to come near God. No one else is going to go near the Lord. We've seen through the book of Exodus, and we see many other places in Scripture, that Jesus is the new Moses. The Gospels repaint this picture and this understanding and this comparison. Only Moses can come near and no one else. And only Jesus could come near and no one else. But then Jesus breaks that barrier down, right? 24, 3 through 8, the blood of the covenant. We mentioned it before. I didn't really go into much detail, but Moses talks to the people. He tells them all of these commandments, this understanding of this covenant, and the response of the people. All the words that the Lord had spoken, we will do. They commit themselves to the covenant. God decreed terms of the covenant, and the people agree. Moses then writes down all the words and builds an altar with 12 pillars, and then Moses kills a peace offering. Moses takes half the blood and throws it against the altar, takes the book of the covenant, reads it in the hearing of the people, and after hearing this, they declare compliance. Now look at verse 8. Moses takes the blood and throws it on all the people. Probably wasn't something I wanted to be front row for, but you listen to what he says. Behold the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you in the accordance with all these words. This is the sealing of the covenant between God and the people. First the blood is thrown on the altar, then the law is read. Finally the blood is thrown on the people. This is the blood of the covenant. Blood is the basis of our relationship with God as well. God teaches his people the way to have the relationship through Jesus is through his blood. The blood is sprinkled on the people and indicated that they're now in a covenant relationship with God. They were marked belonging to God. The implication there in the New Testament is just bonkers. The role of Jesus and us belonging to the covenant. Hebrews 9, 11 through 12. When Jesus Christ appeared as a high priest, the good things that have come then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all in the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. God obviously desires to have that covenant relationship with us as well. It's this amazing transition. You read Moses, Jesus, and these same things are paralleling each other. But it's not just written down here, it's also with the imagery. Listen to how Peter starts off his first letter. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who were elect exiles in the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Okay, I give myself. According to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Christ and first blood. You can't escape these parallels. You can't not read Exodus, the story of Christ, and understand. I've run out of time, but it continues. It continues. Fellowship meal we have together. I don't know, what does that remind you of? You obviously have a meal to commemorate what was done for us. Thank you for coming. Next week we'll try to do another 4 chapters. But it is amazing to read these chapters and understand what God was creating and how it's, say, well, that's got nothing to do with me today, but history, God creating covenants and keeping his end of the. Thank you.